May be seated.
So in high school, I had the opportunity to do this more in-depth project on World War II, and my history teacher happened to know this person who she said, "I think you're absolutely going to love them. I want you to go and interview them, but I want you to go to their house and interview them." I said, "Okay, why?" She said, "I'm not going to tell you." I said, "Am I going to be kidnapped? Is this a ransom situation happening?" She said, "No, no, 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 no. You're going to love it. It's going to be great." So I drive the 20 minutes to this person's house, knock on the door. It looks like a normal house, and I'm trying to figure out what Mrs. McCullough is doing. And so she said, and the guy answered, and he said, "Oh, come in, come in." And so I said, "Well, I'm here to interview you. I understand that you were, you were a veteran of World War II." And he said, "Yes. You know what? Um, I think it would be better if you interviewed me downstairs." Like, I really am gonna die. Okay, and this is before cell phones and all of that. So it's just like, well, all right, it's been a good run. So this again, I can't emphasize how normal this house is. And then we go down the steps and around the corner, and suddenly it is a World War II era English pub. He has completely redone his basement so that there is this beautiful bar and these tables, and I just sort of stand there stunned, and he obviously has done this before, and this is part of what the plan is. And he goes, "Pretty good, right?" I go, yeah. And so he then goes on to talk about he had been an RAF pilot in the Battle of Britain. And so he talked all about his experience, and he had become a collector of, British era, especially World War II specific British memorabilia. So he showed me all the different pieces that he had on the walls, all the different things, and the thing that struck me is how passionate he was about his collection. Not in a boastful or braggy way, but he was thrilled and excited about it, and he wanted to share that excitement. In seminary, we history of the Bible class, and my professor said, "Okay, I've got a field trip that we're going to go on that I think you're really going to like." And again, not explaining anything, so the class troops out into the suburbs of Atlanta, and we go to this again normal house. And I'm telling you this story so you remember the RAF, but that had happened many years ago. I wasn't made the connection, and so this normal guy opens the door to his normal house, and the professor goes, "Hey, we're here." And he goes, "Oh, great, come on back." And so all of us, troop through his normal house till we get to an obvious addition that has been built on the back that is, from, I don't know, from sort of this front section here, sort of just this front section big. He has built, actually the whole thing, built this big thing onto his normal size house, and covering all around the edges are old Bibles. And I'm not talking a Bible your grandmother had. I'm talking 1500s and older Bibles that this dude at his house just had. And he had that same sort of energy, except when except when one of my classmates went, "Oh, that's really neat," and starts touching it. Then he got a little huffy about that. But he wanted to show us each and every one of these different Bibles and talk about what would have been happening in the particular time, and how this particular Bible, written in a common language, would have been a death sentence if the church had found out that this particular Bible is not a Gutenberg, but it's the guy who took over from Gutenberg, and you can see the time and attention and care put into this particular work, how this would have been the most treasured thing, not just in the church, but in the town, if someone was able to get a hold of this. And just hearing this guy talk about his collection, you could feel how excited he was, not that he owned it and it was all his, but how excited he was to be able to share it, how excited he was to have other people be a part of that as well. I was reminded of all that this week because I had 2 different people come into my office who have never been in my office before. Some of you know where this is going. And I am so used to all the things in my office that I don't pay attention or even think about it anymore, but I'm standing right beside my desk, and the person standing here, they're back to the door looking at the big thing of windows that I have, and I see that their eyes keep drifting down. They keep losing eye contact, and at first I'm a little offended, and I was like, oh, hey, all right. But then I realized what they're looking at. And what they are looking at is the string of Mr. Potato Heads that are along my back wall. If you have not been in my office, then there are 27 Mr. Potato Heads throughout the different shelves on my back wall. And people aren't used to that. And the question always comes, do you collect them? And so it started with Sarah giving me a Darth Vader Mr. Potato Head. I like Star Wars. I like Mr. Potato Head. Awesome. Well, at our church in North Carolina, I put it prominently on display in my office. People went, oh, hey, that's cool. And the next week they said, hey, I saw this and I thought of you. And so now I have 2 fun Mr. Potato Heads. And then somebody did it. And they did it again. And they did it again. Different people who were like, oh, hey, I was at Target. I saw this. And I thought, oh, that'd be fun. And so all of a sudden, I had about 10 or 15 Mr. Potato Heads that I had not spent any money on. And people kept saying, oh, so you collect those? And I said, apparently I do. And because people keep giving them to me. And what the reason that I keep them out, besides the fact they're awesome, is because I want my office to not just be a boring place with a bunch of books. I want my office to be a place where kids know that I am their pastor as well. And so if you were to go right now, you would see the Potato Heads in a state of disrepair because they are doing what they are supposed to be doing, which is being played with and loved and rearranged in all sorts of ways. And Princess Leia does not look good right now because of all the different formatting that has been done to her. But it is all the different things. In thinking about these kinds of collections, I couldn't help but think about my friend Ben. Now, Ben and his wife Tammy are the couple that introduced Sarah and I. Ben's been my best friend since the moment we met. Ben doesn't have a collection like Potato Heads or World War II memorabilia or anything like that. Ben, since as long as I've known him, Ben collects people. And here's what I mean by that. Not serial killer stalker kind of way. So this is a coded message. Please help. Make sure someone take Ben down. But he would appreciate that joke. I noticed it when I was at Ben and Tammy's wedding, and I just started talking with all of the people. Because when you go to somebody's wedding and you see all the other aspects of their life, it's fascinating to see how other people know the people that you know. And Ben, and this has happened in several situations since, Ben has this wide network of people who, when I say, well, how do you know Ben? Oh, we went to school together. Okay, so you were friends in school? He went, and they would go, no, not really. I went, okay, I want to ask him, why are you here? And the person would say, well, we had a pretty small graduating class, and Ben would, even though we weren't super close in school, every 6 months or so, Ben would just reach out and call and just see how I'm doing. And after a couple of years, I realized he's the only one who does that. None of the people who I supposedly was close with or really good friends with would do that. But Ben every once in a while, I said, so was something going on in your life that he knew about? No. I mean, everything was fine. And that's when it sort of struck me that Ben actually cares. And I realized that's somebody that I wanted in my world. Now, that's one story. But it was repeated over and over and over that this is what Ben did. Ben, without meaning to, without announcing, without saying, you're my project now, without saying anything like that, Ben saw people, really saw them. And when you are in the presence of someone who really sees you, not somebody who's checking their phone while you're talking, not somebody who's checking their Apple Watch to check their phone so that they can do whatever they're doing while they're talking, not somebody who is waiting for you to breathe so that they can jump in with the next thing that they're going to say, but somebody who really sees you and really hears you, your soul resonates with that. You open up in a way that words almost can't describe. That's one of the most remarkable things about my friend Ben, is that place after place after place, through all the different, he's a pastor as well, through all the different churches he's served, through all the different places he's gone, through the good and the bad of his life, he keeps collecting people that God puts in his path, and those people know that they are seen and heard because Ben stops and pays attention to them. We are continuing our series today. Now, this has been probably the longest sermon series we have ever done, but I am loving what it is opening up in us, and we're calling our series Big Questions. And these questions come from a book, Seriously Dangerous Religion, that an Old Testament professor wrote. And so the questions that we have looked at all the way up till now are, let's just be honest, these are not the questions of how I would phrase them. These are definitely written by a seminary professor because no one in their right mind talks like this. How am I to relate to my neighbor? That's not what normal people say. But I'm using the question because it is a good frame for us to be thinking about all of the different aspects of what it is we believe and the foundational elements of what it means to be human, what it means to follow God, what it means for us to respond to what God has done in and through Jesus and in our world. So, 1,000,000 years ago, we started with the first sermon on the world, and we talked about how in God's design and in God's plan, the world is good. We talked then about a God who is not bound the same way we're bound, a God who steps out of time, a God who is both past, present, and future at the same time in a way that our brains melt trying to make sense of. We talked about that humanity was made to be image bearers. We are the ones who reflect back to God and reflect to each other the goodness that God has given and that God has put in us. That is our joy and our opportunity. We talked about suffering and evil in the world and how sin exacerbates that and the poison that comes from sin. We then talked about how knowing that knowledge doesn't do any good unless we choose to respond, unless we choose to do the good that we can do. We can't solve every problem, but God has put problems in your pathway, and you can tackle those. And with that framework, we talked last week about how am I to relate to God? How am I to orient myself towards God? And we talked about the idea of sort of seeing God as a problem, but my argument was that if we are able to view God as a loving parent who knows more than we do, who has wisdom beyond our understanding, and whose ways are better than our ways, and we trust God with our life, then that is the best possible way that we can choose to live. So, with all of that as the foundation built up, we then come to the question of how am I to relate to my neighbor? And for that, we are going to look at maybe one of the most famous parables that Jesus has given. Now, it is in Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. Now, this morning, we're going to be reading out of the English Standard Version, the ESV. So the words, I'm actually going to put the words up on the screen because after I had that bright idea, I realized I don't yet have a physical copy of the ESV. So we are going to be reading off the screen the words of Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him, obviously Jesus, to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" Anytime people ask Jesus a question, Jesus then answers with a question, right? And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." Okay? We end the story here. Everybody high fives and goes home. Except, no, stop. Okay. But he, the lawyer, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, okay, that's fine and all. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Totally. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Totally fine. Just one question. Who is my neighbor? Which is an interesting question, right? Because I would imagine, even if we were to think and to talk about it, as we describe and define neighbor, the song I grew up hearing on Sesame Street is, "Who are the people in your neighborhood, the people that you meet each day?" I'm not sure that you necessarily would just define those people as your neighbors now, because the global village that we are a part of, you may work with people who are around the world. There are people worshiping with us who are many, many miles away from here. And sadly, you may not know the names of the people who live directly around you. There may be a lot of other people who you are more connected to who would, for you, be a neighbor. So, Jesus either answers a question with a question, or when somebody gives a question to Jesus, he then tells a story. And Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers." Okay, this is not, just so you know, this is not going from here to Crofton, okay? This is the road between Jerusalem and Jericho is about 20 miles, and it dives 3,000 feet in altitude in that time. It is known as the Bloody Path because it's also not just a straight shot down, because it goes so far down so quickly. There are all of these switchbacks and turns. It is known as the Bloody Path because if you were looking to attack someone who is on the road, this is the perfect place to do it. So, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell among robbers who stripped him, beat him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Oh, okay. Corey, are you doing it? Okay, awesome. That's exciting. So, now by chance, a priest was going down that road. Look, a paid church person. Good news, everybody. They'll be able to help. Now a chance, a priest was going down that road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Corey, will you just do it for me, please? Thank you. Okay. All right. The priest comes by. He sees him, and he makes a concerted effort to be as far away from him as possible and goes around. The Levite, who would be another church official, sort of one step above a deacon for us, sees him and does the exact same thing. Jesus, now zoom back to Jesus telling the story, but a Samaritan, at which point everybody goes, because there's all of this history with the Israelites and the Samaritans. We don't have time to go into all of that history, but just imagine the person that you hate the most. Just imagine the person who never does anything right, the person who is always disruptive, the person who just infuriates you beyond belief. That's the person in this story. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. When he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the lawyer, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Okay, so the priest and the Levite, I missed this because I heard the story growing up, but I missed this detail growing up, so I don't want you to miss it. Because growing up, I jumped to an assumption. I'm sure I wasn't listening, but when people said this, but I jumped to the assumption that the priest and the Levite were just being selfish. Just like there are bad dentists, there are bad preachers, there are bad priests and bad Levites, and he just happened to get the bad one, right? You didn't get the good guy, you got the bad one. But I don't think that's the case, because there are good church reasons why the priest and the Levite didn't stop and help. See, the priest and the Levite were on their way up to Jerusalem. They were on their way up to church. They were on their way up to serve. Probably this was their turn to come and serve once a year in the big show. They had been called up to the big mother church and were going to get to help lead worship in God's house, not just in their local sort of synagogue, but they were going up to God's house to lead. This was a big deal. This was Easter and Christmas Eve all wrapped into one for them, okay? Here's the rules, though. You can't be ceremonially unclean and then lead worship. If you touch a dead body, you are ceremonially unclean. If you touch someone who is bleeding and hurt, you are it's a little iffier, but it's still ceremonially unclean. So, if they stop and help this guy, they can't do the important work that they're called to do. Well, this annoys me with the story, because it's a lot easier if the priest and the Levite are just selfish bad guys, right? Because I can see myself as not a selfish bad guy. Right? I can say, look, that's not me. Because when you think about it, when you look at this guy who is hurt, there's 3 ways that you can look at him. And the first way that you look at him is an enemy, which is how we have the opportunity to look at people. Enemies are those who we dehumanize and devalue, who, if they have stuff we want, we just take it. Now, unless you are a toddler or a political world leader, you have learned that this is not how things work. And you don't do this, right? But that's what an enemy is. An enemy is someone who is unworthy of you, that if they have something you want, you take it, and if you can't take it, you might as well ruin it for everybody, because if I can't have it, nobody can have it. Think Cain and Abel. Of the offering that Cain and Abel, the children of Adam and Eve, the offering that Abel makes is pleasing to God. The offering that Cain makes isn't pleasing to God. Cain gets angry because Abel's offering is pleasing, and so Cain kills him. He kills him because he sees him and labels him as an enemy, okay? The robbers in this story saw the guy on the road as a resource. He had stuff, I want stuff, I beat him up, I take his stuff, okay? That is a way that we can view people. And there are forces in our culture that want you to view people as enemies, and they get rich when you view people as enemies. This is as far away from Jesus as it could possibly be. The robbers saw the man as an enemy. Now, the priest and the Levite, I want them to be selfish. I want them to be bad. But what if Instead, they saw the man as a rival. And here's what I mean by that. I don't think that they thought this guy bleeding on the road was going to get to Jerusalem first and get to do the worship service that they were doing. But rival in the sense of we are competing for the goods and the space and the time, and if I give my goods and space and time to you, then I won't have enough left to give to somebody else. It's the idea of scarcity versus generosity. There are all sorts of people who think, look, I'm going to have mine over here and you have yours over there, and I hope you do well. I don't wish bad on you, but I also I nothing you, right? Like, you can do your thing and that's fine, but I'm going to do my thing. And as long as your thing doesn't interfere with my thing, then I don't care. Because there are so few resources that we have a rivalry for them. The priest and the Levite had to step aside because if they had gotten involved with this guy, they had no way to know that their agenda could continue the way that they wanted. They, I don't think, wished ill on this guy, but they certainly didn't care enough to inconvenience themselves. So, you can see this guy as an enemy, someone that you just take things from. You can see him as a rival in that when everything's fine and he's okay, that's okay. But if he's going to cost me something, then I don't want any part of him. What's yours is yours, what's mine is mine. But the Samaritan saw him as a neighbor. And see, that's why we use the word neighbor, is because Jesus is redefining neighbor for us here. Because what is it the Samaritan does? The Samaritan takes his time. The Samaritan takes his money. The Samaritan puts the guy in a place where the Samaritan himself may not be welcome. The Samaritan does all of these things not because this is old Joe, and I've known Joe forever, and I love Joe, and he's good people, so he's worth taking care of. He sees him as neighbor because he is a fellow human being in need, and so he is willing to get involved and help. This is challenging, right? Because we're a lot better if we can walk away and say, hey, don't be selfish like the priest and the Levite, be open-hearted like the Samaritan. But what if instead the challenge is, obviously don't see people as enemies, that's poisonous to you and destructive to them. But also, if you live seeing people as rivals, as competitors for your time, effort, money that's yours and no one else's, you live with this attitude of scarcity that sees other people in competition with you and loses the opportunity to be community. Because you can't be in brutal competition and still be in faithful community. What if instead, what Jesus is inviting us to do is to redefine neighbor as anybody who is struggling, anybody who is in need, those who God has put in our path to help and serve? What if that's God's definition? And what if, continuing the story, God explains to us, it may cost you time, it may cost you money, it may cost you aggravation, it may ruin the plan that you have, but what if this is God's desire for us, to be living in such a way with our neighbors that community can't help but form? What if this is God's desire? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in addition to being a civil rights leader, was also a preacher. And so he preached on this passage several times. And one of the famous questions that he has, or one of the famous statements he has about this passage, is that our Christianity hinges on which question we rest with. Are we going to rest with the question of the priest and the Levite? Because their question is, if I stop and help this man, what will it do to me? But see, the Samaritan's question is, if I don't stop and help this man, what will become of him? How are we to relate to our neighbor? We are to relate in a way that when God puts a neighbor in our path, that we are called to help. We are to use our time, our money, our resources. We are to sacrifice our plan for what God may have us to do. We are to relate to our neighbors by being a collector of people, of seeing and hearing them where their need is, of meeting them where they are and loving them as we have experienced the love of Christ. What will happen to me if I stop and help versus what will happen to him if I don't stop and help? How are we to relate to our neighbor? Like the Samaritan, who gives of himself when he sees his neighbor